Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Thursday edition of the Three Martini Lunch, along with Jim Geraghty of National Review, also the author of Between Two Scorpions. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We have multiple good martinis today. Good, and crazy. And, as promised yesterday, we have a very special feature at the end of this podcast related to politics and the start of the NFL season, which actually kicks off tonight with the 100th season of the NFL, Bears versus Packers. We're going to put a little bit of a different twist on it. If you've read the Morning Jolt, you already kind of know what's going to happen. Jim, let's start with our good martini, and we don't get to say this often, but an egregious wrong in Washington has been made right. Let's go to the Free Beacon. Department of Labor employee Leif Olson will return to his post one day after stepping down in the wake of a Bloomberg Law article that wrongfully accused him of anti-Semitism. Olson tweeted confirmation from his Twitter account Wednesday night. Quote, "I am grateful to be heading back to work. Thank you, Acting Secretary Pat Pizzella and Administrator Cheryl Stanton, for the opportunity to continue to serve." And in a subsequent tweet, he writes, "And to everyone who reached out, and especially to each of you who risked your own credibility and reputation to defend mine, Joe and I can never thank you enough. Each of you is a blessing, and we hope to bless you in return. Thank you, and thank you again." Acting Labor Secretary Patrick Pizzella personally made the decision, a senior Labor Department official told the Daily Caller. He concluded that a correction is much better than an injustice. So, Jim, usually these things end up being, well, it's a shame that happened. That really wasn't fair. But, oh, squirrel, look what the next story is. This time, wrong situation was made right.
It is. Now, this is not to say the story, at least from where I've sat, should be completely laid to bed and we should all move on. There's still that question of Bloomberg Law reporter Ben Penn and Bloomberg Law as an institution. The justification for taking the comments out of context and treating sarcastic remarks as if they were meant literally was that, well, look, he stepped down, so clearly he must have done something wrong. That's something of, circuitous logic there in that, he had to resign. Well, yes, he resigned because you wrote a story that made him sound like he said something that he didn't do. As of this recording, still no word of any retraction from Bloomberg Law, no comment from Ben Penn. A couple folks had reached out to him and to his employer, no comment on either one of those. Look, not only does this warrant a retraction, I don't like calling for people to get fired or something like that, but this is the sort of thing where there really should be some sort of serious consequence for Ben Penn. And, oh, by the way, as we said earlier in the week, the person who edited it, who didn't notice or didn't recognize that those Facebook comments were sarcastic for not getting, any clarification or any comment from Olson himself. And, look, this should be a giant black mark on the reputation of Bloomberg Law. And I don't know if anyone should trust their report. In fact, I tell you, you should not trust their reporting until they make amends on this.
I think that's a very good piece of advice. And it was interesting yesterday morning that Penn and everyone else at Bloomberg Law had just moved on to other stories, pretending like nothing had happened. And to the credit of a lot of folks on the left, we don't see this that much anymore. Even folks like Jonathan Chait and even Vox, I think, was out there saying, wait a minute, Bloomberg Law, this is way over the line. So even folks who didn't really have the vested interest from an ideological standpoint to stand up for Leif Olson actually did so. And now that the Labor Department has restored him, that's good too. But you're absolutely right. This is perhaps one of the darkest moments in partisan journalism in a very long time. And we talk about them almost on a daily basis. But this one is perhaps the most egregious that we've seen in a very long time.
I'd like to think that this was a rare moment of self-awareness on the part of these left of center commentators, that everyone or the vast majority of public commentators will use sarcasm sooner or later. That sarcastic comment, if read literally, could sound like you're saying something that you completely disagree with. For example, the folks at Media Matters who listen to us, or they're geniuses. Well, Jim Geraghty called Media Matters geniuses. That's, it's bad faith. And I think everybody recognizes that, if this is the new rule, it can be used against any of us. If you can lose your comment for a sarcastic remark being interpreted as your actual beliefs, then we're all toast. Then everybody is going to get fired at some point, because almost everybody has done something like this. And it's this institution of this sudden new social rule that sarcasm is a fireable offense.
I know we've been really rough on Ben Penn, and I don't think we've been rough enough, so I'm going to put another name out there to equate him to. We don't have this in the year-end awards, and I don't think anyone should ever name an award after this person, but Ben Penn could be the winner of the Harry Reid Award for, I know the story's bogus, but he's not there anymore, right?
It worked, didn't it?
That's right. Mitt Romney didn't become president after I lied about him not paying taxes, right? Except in this situation, Ben Penn didn't ultimately get what he wanted because Leif Olson is back on the job. So good martini.
We could create a new subcategory for the bad faith attack that doesn't work.
Let's move on to our second good martini, and this is jumping off of yesterday's crazy martini, where we were talking about how essentially this peace deal between the United States and the Taliban largely amounts to trusting that the Taliban will not harbor terrorist organizations or carry out their own terrorist attacks, even while they're carrying out terrorist attacks while they're doing this supposed negotiation. So here's the twist for today. Time magazine, which still writes articles apparently. The U.S. is closing in on a deal with the Taliban that is designed to wind down America's 18-year war in Afghanistan. But the best indication of how risky the pact may be is this. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is declining to sign it, according to senior U.S., Afghan, and European officials. They then talk about what Zalmay Khalilzad has hammered out in 9 rounds of talks with the Taliban representatives. But the deal doesn't ensure several crucial things. Those familiar with the discussions tell Time. It doesn't guarantee the continued presence of U.S. counterterrorism forces to battle al-Qaeda, the survival of the pro-U.S. government in Kabul, or even an end to the fighting in Afghanistan. Quote, no one speaks with certainty. None, said an Afghan official taking part in briefings on the deal with Khalilzad. It's all based on hope. There is no trust. There is no history of trust. There is no evidence of honesty and sincerity from the Taliban. And intercepted communications show that they think they have fooled the U.S., while the U.S. believes that should the Taliban cheat, they will pay a hefty price. Now, ultimately, the final word from the State Department here, Jim, is that, look, if everybody's on board, including the President of the United States, then Pompeo will be the assigned signatory to this thing, and he'll do his duty and sign it. But we're a long way from getting to the point where everybody who needs to be on board is on board.
2 things kind of jump out at this. The first is it does recognize that there are some people in the U.S. government who at least see the situation clearly. I have no illusions that basically the American public believes we should leave Afghanistan, we should completely withdraw our troops from Afghanistan, and they don't foresee any bad things happening after we leave Afghanistan. I think this is wrong. I think this is ignorant of history. This is ignorant of very recent history, including what happened in Iraq when we withdrew all of our troops. But fine, all right? The American public chooses to believe the other aspect. And I have very little doubt that the President of the United States wants to be able to say we're out of Afghanistan when he's running for re-election in 2020. Or if he can't do that, he wants to say we're almost out of Afghanistan and everyone will be home by this time next year when he's running for re-election in 2020. The good news here is that Mike Pompeo, at least, and my guess is if he's having this attitude, there are other people in the United States government at high level who recognize the risk here, who recognize that you have a chance of looking really dumb. You have a chance of looking really naive, and you have a chance of looking like something akin to the modern Chamberlain if part of your withdrawal from Afghanistan is a promise from the Taliban not to sponsor terrorism. As I wrote yesterday, if you want to leave Afghanistan, I think I don't think it's the right move, but fine, go ahead and do it. Don't run around and say, oh, by the way, we've got an agreement with the Taliban. Like, that just makes you look stupid. And that is what, Pompeo is probably trying to save both his own reputation down the road for not being the Chamberlain, holding up a piece of paper signed by the Taliban declaring peace in our time. I don't know whether he has presidential ambitions down the road. There's still occasional talks about him running for Senate someday. Pompeo recognizes anybody who signs that deal with the Taliban is going to look really stupid for a really long time. So the interesting question will be whether the president wants to have that associated with himself. If we're going to leave Afghanistan, fine. Don't go through the charade of a peace deal with the Taliban. And I think this indicates it may not actually go through. Now, again, I still think we're going to leave. I still think we'll eventually have all our troops leave, but at least we won't go through this, ludicrous idea that the Taliban are some sort of responsible partner in peace.
Yeah, if the Obama administration was pulling this off, how loud do you think the howls would be on the right?
Oh, look, this is another example in which a whole bunch of folks who got, really livid with stuff Obama did, I would argue, legitimately, whether it was deficits, whether it was, meeting with dictators and things like that. are perfectly fine with it when it's their guy who's doing the exact same thing.
All right, let's move on to the crazy martini now, Jim. And there's no better place to be for the crazy martini than San Francisco, California. This is from KPX CBS 5 in the Bay Area. By a unanimous vote, San Francisco's Board of Supervisors have passed a resolution declaring the National Rifle Association a domestic terrorist organization and urging other cities to follow their example. While the vote was mostly symbolic, city officials were ordered to, quote, take every reasonable step to limit, unquote, business interactions with the NRA and its supporters. Supervisor Catherine Stefani, whose district includes the Marina and Presidio neighborhoods, sponsored the resolution because of federal inaction in the wake of a mass shooting in nearby Gilroy, where a gunman opened fire at the city's famed Gilroy Garlic Festival, killing 3 and injuring 20 before killing himself. Quote, the NRA spreads propaganda that misinforms and aims to deceive the public about the dangers of gun violence, Stefani's resolution declares. Quote, all countries have violent and hateful people, but only in America do we give them ready access to assault weapons and large-capacity magazines, thanks in large part to the National Rifle Association's influence, the resolution continues. In a Twitter post Wednesday morning, the NRA called the San Francisco vote a reckless assault on a law-abiding organization. Quote, this is a reckless assault on a law-abiding organization, its members, and the freedoms they all stand for. We remain undeterred, guided by our values and belief in those who want to find real solutions to violence. So, Jim, it's San Francisco, so take that with a lot of salt. But what do you make of the mangling of the English language here to declare the NRA a terrorist organization?
You know, Greg, this is our crazy martini, but it could very well have been our bad martini. And I know everybody's like, it's San Francisco. They're crazy out there. Indeed. But I think this is really setting a dangerous precedent. Not merely because they're calling upon other city councils to do the same thing. To quote the great Rush Limbaugh, words mean stuff. You don't get to hand wave and suddenly change it to what you want it to be, to make the words what you want them to mean. The San Francisco Board of Supervisors really hates the NRA. Fine. It's a free country. You're free to have that. Right? If you want to say we abhor the NRA, go right ahead. If you want to say you think the NRA is wrong, fine. You want to argue that there shouldn't be a Second Amendment and some people should try to repeal it, go right ahead. Be my guest. Please get as many members of your party to run on that explicitly in the next election as possible. However, the words terrorism and the term domestic terrorist organization have meanings, right? You know what you have to do to be a terrorist? Commit acts of terror. That's why they call them terrorists, right? Besides the fact that the line of thinking as espoused by the city council here is that the NRA is responsible for things that people who are not members do. When we start using the term terrorist to describe people who have not broken the law, who are not plotting violence against others, who are not attempting to achieve a political goal through a non-legitimate, non-legal, violent act, right? Then, first of all, I think it waters down the word. And by fears, you'll end up with everybody calling everybody else terrorists. Now, Greg, we've just been through an argument in which, by picking on Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and all of these the squad, President Trump was allegedly inciting terrible acts of violence against them. Now, I'm sure they're getting death threats. And you know what? That stinks. That's absolutely terrible. Nobody should be sending death threats in this country. Trump has, to the best of my knowledge, not called Ilhan Omar a terrorist. And he should not, because she is not a terrorist. Now, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib have associated with some really unsavory characters. I recommend everyone take a look at that David French article about the organization that wanted to sponsor their trip to Israel. But if you say, hey, Ilhan Omar is a terrorist, you know what? You're wrong factually, and I think you are doing damage to our public discourse. Because to me, terrorism matters, right? You should use that term on Timothy McVeigh. You should use that term on Omar Mateen. You should use that term on Eric Rudolph, right? There are people who have earned that label by trying to commit acts of violence. Having an opinion you really disagree with is not an act of violence. And there's kind of one more point on the language there, saying city employees should take every reasonable step to limit business interactions with the NRA or its supporters. I would love to know if the government of San Francisco has any business interaction with the NRA at all. My guess is none. It's not like they hold the conference there. I'd be pleasantly surprised if there actually was a NRA club or people are active in the NRA in San Francisco. But my suspicion is that part will have no particular meaning. But the more interesting thing is the interaction with city contracts. In other words, let's assume you're the guy who makes the orange traffic cones that the city uses for when it's doing construction or road repair or something like that. And you've got a contract to provide the city with orange traffic cones, but you're an NRA member, you're a big NRA donor, NRA bumper sticker on your truck, all that kind of stuff. And the city says, oh, my goodness, well, we have to limit this. The city council has said we have to take every reasonable step to limit our business interactions. We're canceling our contract with you. If that comes to pass, the city is probably going to lose it. They're probably going to get sued, and they're probably going to lose for this. This is in today's Morning Jolt. I did a little research. Kind of surprising. There was a recent decision by a federal court that said, look, there was an agency. They had to do blacktop on I think it was an Air Force base. The company that was supposed to do the blacktop wasn't doing a great job. They had all kinds of delays. They had a subcontractor that fell through for them. And the relationship between the government agency folks who had hired them for the contract and the contracting company just got worse and worse. So they canceled the contract. And you might say, oh, okay, well, it's the Air Force. It's their contract. They got every right to cancel it. No, they do not. They did not clear the threshold to cancel the contract in the eyes of the federal court. And what's more is the federal court determined that a personal animosity was a big factor in this decision. It declared, look, objectivity must be the hallmark of any decision to terminate for default. Therefore, government personnel should remember to focus on the facts and make every attempt to work with the contractor before taking steps to terminate for cause. Now, look, it's possible a different judge will look at this a little bit differently, but based on this precedent, you would think the city of San Francisco canceling a contract with a contractor over the contractor's views on the National Rifle Association or the Second Amendment or gun rights, they would probably say that is a wrongful termination of the contract, and they would lose the case. So, again, this is government by tantrum. This is just saying what you want. Declaring words mean what you want them to mean. My fear is that this mentality will spread. That in addition to the usual "you have blood on your hands" arguments you get after a mass shooting, that city governments will start labeling people terrorists for having a viewpoint they don't like. And then at some point, some unhinged loon is going to start shooting people, like, say, at a softball game, or maybe going to the Focus on the Focus on Family offices or one of those organizations?
Family Research Council, yeah.
The Family Research Council, and start shooting them because, hey, the city council said they were terrorists. This is a complete abrogation of the responsibility of leadership in government. And as crazy as it is, I think this is one more step down a very dark path that some of us are trying desperately to scream at people not to do this. But, Greg, a lot of days, I'm not sure it does any good.
This is a really embarrassing moment for San Francisco. And this is a city that is literally awash with human waste on its streets. And this is perhaps even more embarrassing for them and even more embarrassing than the 49ers. Yes, football season starts tonight. And Jim, as you pointed out in the Morning Jolt today, you and I are having a mini fantasy draft, not of NFL players, but of Democratic presidential primary contenders. We're going to have 3 rounds here, each of us getting 3 picks, and you are on the clock.
Yeah, just people wondering what the heck are Jim and Greg doing. Greg, I've always liked the idea of fantasy football. I'm a football fan. I do think it gets a little weird where you're like, I don't care that my team is ahead. Who scored the touchdown? And suddenly you become really interested in that. Who scored this meaningless touchdown in a 48-0 rout between 2 teams you don't follow at all. But and again, I've been invited to be part of leagues. It sounds like fun, but Greg, I don't know about you. I just don't have the mental real estate to really get into this, in part because my day job requires me to cover the Democratic presidential primary. So I'm making the best of both worlds, and we're creating our Democratic presidential primary fantasy league. And I had some high hopes. I had some really good picks that I was ready for. I had to change it a little bit. I'll be honest. My first overall pick was going to be Kirsten Gillibrand, senator from New York, running for president. I don't know if you heard, Greg. It turns out she got an ACL.
Ooh.
She's actually craven lousy candidate. So she's off. She's out of it. My first pick then will be a tight end out of Stanford. No, I'm not making that up. Cory Booker, senator from New Jersey. There's actually coverage of him. You can actually go online and find back in the early 90s, Cory Booker did get to Stanford. He does have a football scholarship, and he was a pretty darn good one. Not good enough to make it to the pros, but he has some nice highlights there. So, look, whatever else you think of Cory Booker, probably makes a pretty good tight end.
All right. Well, the first pick is in the books. I don't know who the commissioner of our league is, but if it's still Roger Goodell, he's getting booed right now as Cory Booker comes on stage and holds up his Jim Geraghty jersey. For my first pick, one of the most important factors to look for when drafting a real player or a fantasy player is adaptability and flexibility, particularly when the game plan needs to be altered. And when it comes to politics, no one can intentionally or unintentionally change the facts like former Vice President Joe Biden. So are you in one state but wish you were in another? Just say so. Biden's your guy. Is your current position out of step? No worries. Biden can just dust off that play from 1979 and you're back in business. And like any good game manager, quarterback Joe Biden knows he just needs to get the ball to his playmakers. And in his case, he's going to hand off the ball to the Obama legacy to pander to the liberal base as much as humanly possible. That thing's going to get like 50, 60 carries a game. So with the first pick in the Democratic fantasy primary, I select Joe Biden.
Some really interesting stuff. Interesting pick there, Greg. I was tempted. A couple of thoughts. One, the eye injury has me a little nervous. For those who watched him at the climate change thing last night, look, for a long time, you're talking about a guy who's been a backup for 8 years. And, that the entire Obama administration, everybody knew he was ready to come into the game, but nobody wanted him to step in for the starter, Obama. There's that question. Look, getting a little long in the tooth. Look, we don't like talking about this part of the game. It kind of takes away the fun for everyone. But don't you think he might belong in the concussion protocol?
We're going to have the closest scrutiny, absolutely. In other words, if he can tell us within at least a decade what year it is, he's going back in the game. All
right, there you go. Good. A little margin of error there. So
yes,
that's pretty good.
Yes.
All right, my second pick, I went with a guy who's a lot of people said he was undersized, small school, obscure background, but I'm going with Julian Castro, former mayor, former secretary of HUD. Now, here's the thing, Greg. A lot of people, he's got a bit of a reputation, and some people said he's got some dirty hits in his past. Like he will take completely out of line shots at people long after the whistle's blown. Turns out it was actually Joaquin Castro, twin brother, doing the doxing and all that kind of stuff. So it was that one or Beto out of Texas, and I just kind of figured that Castro was one of those guys. First of all, he had some good shots. I mean, he hit Beto pretty hard in that one. Actually, Beto ended up going into the concussion protocol after that first debate. So Julian Castro is my second pick. I'm forecasting him as really as a cornerback, nickelback, because this guy can move pretty fast from mayor to HUD to presidential candidate in a rapid amount of time.
Excellent pick. He could be tougher than most offenses realize. I almost went with Beto also. Because, when you take the broad view, especially like the media's 2018 Senate campaign view, boy, it looks like this guy could be dangerous. But about midway through the second quarter of the season opener, you realize there's really not much there. And you're not going to devote more than one nickelback over there to try to figure out what he's doing. Plus, if you play him on defense, all those wild gestures, you get all sorts of hands to the face penalties and it's just trouble. So I said I went with Joe Biden because of his adaptability and flexibility. And while versatility is nice, you can't have everyone just freewheeling or the whole system falls apart. You need a captain who's willing to slap people in the face and tell everyone they're doing things wrong regularly because people love that and that you're deeply, deeply disappointed in them. And no one is better at that than Elizabeth Warren, who I often liken to the nitpicker from your local homeowners association who reports you because your mailbox is 8 inches from the curb instead of 9. Like the center on the offensive line, she will harangue the team incessantly to execute the game plan properly. Everyone will loathe her, but they'll do their jobs just to avoid getting yelled at again. And just like the great Jim Thorpe, perhaps the greatest football player ever, Warren brings another intangible to the game. That's right, she's from Oklahoma. What did you think I was going to say? Which is now a football factory, by the way. Billy Sims played college ball there, Barry Sanders, Adrian Peterson, Baker Mayfield, Kyler Murray. So Elizabeth Warren, second-round draft pick in the books.
All right, so I just want to double-check, Greg. Your team name is the Corombos Redskins? You went right up to the line. I veered right over it. I'm going to yell false start on me. Let's just kind of observe that you're right. You talked a moment earlier about overhyped draft choices. Beto O'Rourke really is the Ryan Leaf of presidential candidates. The 4 listeners who remember Ryan Leaf are saying, yes, absolutely. That's a pretty good pick. Those are 2 big name folks. I was tempted about Warren, but Greg, she's from New England, and I just can't stand anybody from New England. But let's also look when people say, players out of this region. Let's just also keep in mind, a bunch of years back, people drafted out of Massachusetts, John Kerry, Mike Dukakis, even the guy who I had high hopes for, Mitt Romney. So I know everyone says, "Oh, Massachusetts, it's a powerhouse in politics. They churn out presidential candidates." Yeah, but do they ever win? Right? Fair question. Can't win the big game. That's my fear out of that. So my third pick, I'm kind of Mel Kiper Jr. I like to look for the guys who are not as well known, got great agility, great mobility, as Mel Kiper says every year when they take him out of the cryogenic chamber for his draft coverage. And so I'm going with little known, one of the Blue Hens of Delaware, John Delaney. I'm going to start him at offensive guard because, while most people don't find him terribly offensive, he does have an ability to put other candidates on the defensive, like when he points out for supporters of Medicare for All that, most Americans who like their coverage don't want to lose it. So a lot of people underestimate this guy, but I think he does cause people to underestimate this. Now, again, Warren says he's got a conservative game plan. I think sometimes running it up the middle is great. Now, here's the thing. The thing with Delaney, and some people have said this about Biden and a bunch of these other candidates, Hickenlooper back before he blew out his his brain. The argument is that they always run it up the middle. Now, I've looked at these guys. I've looked at the record. I've watched the tape. I don't think they really run it up the middle. I think when push comes to shove, they're always going to the left side of the line. But that's my assessment there, Greg.
Very good. Very good. Well, you never want to be Mr. or Ms. Irrelevant in a draft, but somebody has to be that. And since there's only 3 rounds, you're about to find out who it is. With my final pick in the Democratic fantasy political draft, I need a player that the opponent simply cannot game plan for because you just never know what they're going to say or do. Think Terrell Owens or Chad Johnson. Yeah, they'll make you wonder what planet they're on sometimes, but they can also break a game wide open. So you want to talk healthcare policy? Good luck staying on that topic when my draft pick starts assailing the forces of darkness or begins harnessing love. Much like a trash-talking defensive back, Marianne Williamson can get in the other candidates' heads like no one else. And while we know she's not big on game plans, which will clash with Elizabeth Warren quite extensively, Marianne Williamson might not even look like she's paying attention on defense. She'll take some bizarre circuitous route, playing zone when everybody else is in man. And then all of a sudden, when you least expect it, she'll step in front of the opposing receiver for a pick 6 just when you need it most.
That's a really good choice there, Greg. Maybe I missed somebody who was good. I also want to point out that, again, you take the field with the players you have. There was one other guy who I was looking forward to, kind of local. A lot of people think Virginia is a pretty good spot for developing players. Terry McAuliffe, former governor, much to everyone's surprise, the least embarrassing governor of Virginia out of the last 3. But it turns out he didn't run. He had cold feet, much like Oakland Raiders wide receiver Antonio Brown. Okay, for those of you who don't follow football, Antonio Brown was apparently doing cryogenics to help his body or something and got severe frostbite on his feet. He's fine now, or at least as fine mentally as Antonio Brown gets. But, so that was the most outrageous injury I've heard in a while. So you can explain a joke, Greg, but you can't save it.
So hopefully you enjoyed our fantasy Democratic presidential primary draft. Good luck to your favorite team, although, as we've said before, we really don't mean it for a lot of teams. But we certainly do for the Bears. And, Jim, for your Jets, the season starts tonight. Those of you who don't like football but your spouse does, it's over in 4 months, and you'll get to talk to each other again sometime in the winter. So, Jim, see you tomorrow.
For a bunch of these teams, the season actually, the meaningful part of the season ends pretty early. So, honey, I'll be chatting with you in October, probably. Anyway, always good to join you, Greg. Take care.
Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. And be sure to tune in again on Friday for the next Three Martini Lunch.